Well, welcome everybody to a new episode of Port Perspectives. I'm Captain Jeff Monroe. I'm the Director of Education Programs for the International Association of Maritime and Port Executives. And this is an ongoing series of programs basically focused on management in the port industry and some ideas from some top professionals within our industry who have really been very successful in leading ports and finding other niches within the industry. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Steve Ribuffo, who is the Port Director for the Don Young Port of Alaska, which is located in Anchorage, Alaska. And as a disclaimer, Steve is chairman of our board of advisors for the IAMPE, which is a 22-person board of senior officials who advise the association on directions in regards to education programs and stuff. And he is also a certified maritime educator as well as an accredited maritime port executive. So, Steve, welcome to have you aboard, and thank you for taking the time to chat with us today.
No, you're welcome. This is about the only opportunity we have to talk. So
yes, it probably is.
And I have to say, I'm happy to do it.
There's a 4-hour difference between us and Steve, but I'm not going to anticipate lag time. Anyway, Steve, tell us a little bit about how you got to be port director, a little bit about your history, and what path you took from the time when you got out of college or wherever until where you are today.
No, yeah, happy to do, because it's pretty pretty unique. And whenever I meet a new captain of the port who comes down from the local Coast Guard sector, the conversation always goes to, how in the world does a retired Air Force guy get to run a port? And so it's an interesting story, and it starts from the time where I was stationed up here on Elmendorf Air Force Base at the time as the director of logistics for the headquarters Alaskan Command. And when you are the director for logistics in a military organization, you own the engineers and the real estate people as part of the joint headquarters organization. And the mayor of Anchorage at the time and the port director at the time had some interest in some of the military land that borders the port. We have an interesting relationship with the Department of Defense here at this port. We are neighbors. A fence line is all that separates the two of us. And with that comes some great advantages when it comes to moving military equipment to this strategic port. But there was some land that the port wanted for an expansion project that was going on, started in the late 90s and in the early 2000s. So when you're the guy that owns the real estate people, that you get the rose pinned on you to make sure that whatever land arrangements are going to get made, you're seeing those to closure and walking through the process. So as a consequence of that, I got to know quite a few people in City Hall and all of the players down at the port. And then I did what everybody else in the military does. Your assignment's up and you leave. And my wife and I were reassigned to Fort Belvoir, another joint headquarters in Fort Belvoir back in Virginia. And my plan was to do what every other Air Force colonel I knew at that headquarters did when it was time to retire. You had your ceremony on Friday, you went to the department store on Saturday and you bought a suit. Then you went back to work on Monday doing what you did on Friday as a civilian. So that was my plan. And then one day the phone rang, and it was the person who was the deputy port director up here in Anchorage at the time, who I knew as when she was the garrison commander on Fort Richardson. And she said, I've got aging parents who are not doing very well. My husband's got aging parents who aren't doing very well. We've been going back and forth a week each every month. I think we're getting tired of that. We'd just like to move to somewhere down the lower 48, which is what we call continental United States up here. Yeah, the lower 48, and be closer to them. So the deputy port director job's coming open. Are you interested? Well, after spending 2 years and a little bit more in Washington, D.C. and driving to work every morning with 1 million of my closest friends, it was not a hard decision to come back to Alaska. and where you can drink the water, breathe the air, and do an absolutely fun job. So as a career logistician, it fit right in. And now it's been almost 17 years since we came back, and I've spent all of it at the port.
My goodness gracious, that is, man. Interestingly enough, I don't find it that unusual because the two people who seem to know the most about logistics are people who have come out of the Army and people who have come out of the Air Force, right? And that seems to be a very common thread among folks. But wonderful to have you aboard there. And you and I have known each other for a fair amount of time and have done some work with you guys up there in Anchorage and stuff. So it's been great. So what's going on in the port right now? I know you have a lot of projects going on, a lot of money hoping to spend, and fill us in.
Oh, it's a pretty exciting infrastructure time to be here at the Port of Alaska. I mentioned early on that there was an intermodal expansion project that was started late 90s, early 2000s. Make a long story short, there were some fits and starts in that, and opportunities to rethink exactly what we're going to do from a strategic planning point of view, and settled on a new plan that we now call the Port of Alaska Modernization Program. At the heart of it has always been the same problem. This port, the ribbon was cut on this port when it was the Port of Anchorage back in September of 1961. And true to Alaskan form, you build something and you give absolutely no thought to what the long-term maintenance of it will be. You just wear it out and hope that your delegation is going to send more free money to do what you need to do when you got to do it. And here we are in a position where the condition of the facility is pretty bad shape. We talk about it all the time. We're about one solid earthquake away from the whole thing being in the water. So the solution, that we have no choice but to execute, is to demolish and replace the entire infrastructure. And that's when we call that the Port of Alaska Modernization Program. All in, it's going to take about 12 years. We're about 5 years into that, and probably just shy of $2 billion, given the fact that we are where we are geographically, and the cost of things are different than what you can expect to pay to get the same product in the lower 48. So we are little by little taking care of this, demolish and replace the entire new facility. The other Alaska interesting thing is that only 730,000 people live here. The good news part of that is, they all only eat so much, go buy new clothes so often, put gas in their car tanks twice a week if you own one of those big trucks. So you can forecast pretty easily and manage the demand. But there's only one port that can handle the volumes that support 85% of the population of the state. That's this one. So the big challenge with the modernization program is, because these big container ships have absolutely no place else to go on the mainland part of Alaska, to leave us alone long enough to do this program unimpeded, is you have to figure out a way to stay open for business and demolish and replace the old stuff at the same time. So that's why the timeline to get this done is as long as it is. And that's why and that is going to add to some of the expense. And we have a lot of other environmental challenges here that we have to work around too. And I can go into those as we progress here in this little conversation.
Well, this is a unique circumstance because the vast majority of cargo that's going to the consumers up there is coming out of Seattle, Tacoma, and the lower 48, and coming up through the Port of Alaska, and that you really serve a considerable part of that population.
No, it's true. And if you're a logistician and you're in the commerce business in Alaska, you really have to think like you live on an island, because you have no rail connection to the outside world. We have no utility connections to the outside world, no pipeline connections. There is one road that connects Alaska to the lower 48, and it goes through a foreign country. So you are, for all intents and purposes, an island. and have to think that way with respect to how you're going to support the population. And that's why 90% of the freight that comes into the state of Alaska comes in on the water. Half of that crosses the docks here in Anchorage, and half what crosses the docks here moves on to final destinations that are outside the municipality and the close by surrounding area. So it's a big deal. And being able to stay open for business while we do this modernization program is part of the part of the planning that we can't lose sight of as we focus on how we're going to pull off both those things at the same time, and and not getting gunfights with each other because we're always arguing with the users because they need the dock and we've got barges in the water with mooring lines and all. Yeah, it's a dance that takes a lot of patience and a lot of cooperation to pull off.
Yeah, I think most port directors are faced with the aspect of doing retrofit or capital improvements. It's unique in the circumstance that A, so many people are dependent on what comes over your docks, and B, you've literally got to tear everything down and rebuild the entire thing from scratch, right? And I think that's a very unique circumstance in regards to what goes on within the context of the port industry right now. How did you plan for this, Steve? How did you lay out sort of the direction that you're going to take with all of this and how to get there?
Well, I'll take a little bit of the credit, but not a lot of the credit for having done this. But there are a lot of people that are involved in planning to make sure that we can choreograph this whole thing as best we can, so that and it's more of a reduction in the amount of pain we're all going to face than it is an elimination of any of it, because for a very small footprint, less than 150 acres, all in, and things are moving all the time. When the container ships come in, the dwell time of a container around here averages 8 to 12 hours. So things are always moving because it's a just-in-time kind of economy. So how do you keep that going and get construction going and construction equipment staged and give enough mobilization area to the construction companies so that part of the cost isn't everything's got to come from 5 miles away just when you need it. You can put as much of it as close to the construction site as possible. So you're asking the users to give up some of what has been their traditional transit yards and staging areas for a period of time. And when I say a period of time, I'm thinking 2 years, 3 years, so we can get all this done. I mean, that requires a lot of cooperation on everybody's parts. So we do a lot of talking to each other, and we have to do a lot of sympathizing and empathizing with each other from time to time, because we all know when it's over, it's going to be great. But the getting there part of it is an incredible challenge and requires, like I said, a lot of conversation, a lot of cooperation, a lot of deconflicting of what's needed at certain times. And that's just, the conversations we have with the port users who are tenants here. Then you throw in a cruise ship, or you throw in the military that wants to come up here and make a port call. And all of that has to get worked around this construction schedule and how much of the facility is now unavailable because it's assigned to the construction companies to do their thing. The only way to solve this is you draw a lot of pictures and you do a lot of talking.
I find that what's interesting is that, having spent time up there with you up in Anchorage and having looked at the infrastructure and everything like that, how badly your infrastructure has deteriorated over the course of time here. And I know you've done patchworks with your piles and stuff, put on sheathing and stuff like that. But the bottom line is that the conditions up there in Alaska are so harsh that no matter what you do, no matter what you build, it's going to face these harsh environmental conditions. Plus, just the natural topography up there creates a lot of issues itself. A lot of people recognize that, you have to continually invest in your infrastructure and everything. And you're a municipal port, so you're competing with other elements of the municipality, police, fire, parks and rec, and all the rest of it. How do you balance all of that?
Well, I'm gonna correct that a little bit. We may compete for people's time and attention, but we don't compete for the money. Yeah, there are 4 city departments that are called enterprise funds, which means that we have the responsibility to generate all the revenue to cover our own expenses. We get no property tax dollars to do anything down here. So that's that's part of the challenge, is setting the rates to cover all of our expenses, including payroll. And not only that, but we also have to pay the city a fee in lieu of taxes every year, like any other business would. We pay a dividend to the city every year. And because the way municipal code is written, I don't have a legal staff. I don't have an IT staff. I don't have an HR staff here. I have to reach back to the city and those city departments to provide that service to me, and I pay for them. So that's the arrangement that we have here. Now, we've been successful doing that for 60 plus years. But that also means that there's no general obligation bonds that are issued on behalf of the port to do anything. If we need to take on debt service for anything we're doing, it's going to be a revenue bond, which is going to affect the rates, which is going to get passed on through all the port users to their shippers and to those of us that go shopping. So it's a sensitive thing for us. We know that if we have to raise the rates, the only people that are paying them are Alaskans. Interesting. It's an interesting concept here.
Yeah, I noticed that, some of the highest, the cost of a gallon of milk, cost of gasoline, cost of all of that, you truly are an island economy, because I see the same thing in the Caribbean and stuff when I go down there. So, trying to sort of balance out what you have to do for infrastructure, which everybody is dependent upon, right? And then pay for it, which is then ultimately passed on to the consumer. And, I don't know if consumers really understand the depth of the value of what the port does for folks up there.
No, and it always amazes me how often, and it sort of makes you a little teary-eyed, how often when I'm around town and shopping or what have you, and run into somebody, or I'm standing here at the cash register, and the conversation pops up, and somebody asks me, what do I do? I said, well, I work at the port. And you'd be surprised how many times the answer back is, there's a port. So, so I just scratch my head. But then again, I'm driving here every day, and they are certainly not. But and I wonder, God, are we doing a good enough job of marketing for people to appreciate that? We talk to a lot of groups. And I think there's a place where you draw the line that says above this line, everybody absolutely knows there's a port and how important it is. And below the line, they don't have a clue and really don't care until they go shopping and there's big holes on the store shelves.
Yeah. And
then they only care up until when the holes are filled, and then they forget. So it's the human nature thing. I don't know if it's an Alaska thing or if it's a universal thing, and I haven't really chatted about this with my my colleagues out there, but it's an interesting and sometimes humorous way things are dealt with up here that is sort of interesting.
So I get to thinking about this, and I say to myself, first of all, you're in a very captured market because you're very dependent on the transshipment of cargo from the lower 48, right? You've got harsh environmental conditions, right? You've got very tough winters, right? You're right there on the Pacific coast where everything hits you, right? You're facing, not only the aspect of the cost of transportation, but also, having to rebuild everything and, pay for that as well. And then on top of that, you face something that's very unusual, and that is the aspect of you have earthquakes up there, and you actually have to plan everything around all of your infrastructure around the aspect that there could be a potential earthquake, which is nothing much we deal with in the lower 48 unless you're in California.
No, you're right. And part of the master planning for any new infrastructure you build up here, because the population is so small, and we don't have the luxury to be able to afford redundancy, is you always have to think about building resiliency and paying that cost to put that into your infrastructure, because you have no choice. Alaska is a study in single point failures. because you have a population that is so small that you can't afford to build 2 or 3 ports like this just in case. And because even if you have the ports, you got to get stuff from the port to to the final customer, and the road system is almost non-existent. No roads lead to Nome, for example. You said if you want to get to Nome, you got to fly there, or you got to get on a cruise ship and go there. You can't drive there. You can't drive to. You can drive to Fairbanks. You can take the train to Fairbanks. You can take the train to some other. Well, actually, you can't take the train. You can take some of the road system to some other places, but you are so limited with respect to the infrastructure that we have already. So where would you put another port? And if you go back to the history of the '64 earthquake, Seward was the main port of entry for everything that came into the state of Alaska, because there really wasn't much of anything in Anchorage. Anchorage built this little port, and that's all it was going to be, to see if they could entice barges to come up here and make deliveries to Anchorage, so that things would be fresher than waiting for them to get here from Seward. So, and then the '64 earthquake came, and there was no Seward, and there was no Whittier, and there was no Valdez. All of South Central was devastated. The only port that survived was the little brand new one that was up in Anchorage. So all of those cargo companies that used to go into Seward started to come to Anchorage, and we grew, and they never went back. So now we are who we are, where we are, and Anchorage is the transportation center for pretty much everything that moves around in the state, because it's got the international airport, it's got the main freight yards for the Alaska Railroad, and it's got this port.
And most of the oil comes through you. You have Tote, which is bringing Roro services up there. You've got Matson, which is handling the container services and everything. So you really are very much of a funnel coming into the aspect. So a lot of
a lot of refined petroleum, and most of the refined petroleum that they use at the airport and they use on Joint Base Elmendorf Richardson, or is in the gasoline stations up and down the road and rail system, comes into this port.
Yeah, which is, makes you a strategic military port as well. And I understand you can actually see Russia from there.
When we get the 100 gauge cranes that are where you're about 200 feet up, the likelihood is better.
Steve, you've had a very interesting and unique career, first of all in the military, and then of course now in the port industry. And tell me, if one of the most important things we see with helping a lot of young people coming into the industry, and if you probably notice it the way I do, and you certainly noticed in the classes you teach, that it seems that the crowds are getting younger and younger and younger, and all of a sudden you see a lot of people who are taking the programs who are under 40, who used to, when we first started, there are people my age, so it's a very different take. What advice would you give to young people in preparing for a career that would take them to a location where you might be right now?
No, that's a great question, and I got to say it's exciting and refreshing to see that many young folks moving into this industry, because the time has come for passing the baton, if you will, to a new generation. The challenge is going to be, because I have a couple of kids that are pushing 40 years old. The challenge is, how do you hook them? How do you hook them, and how do you keep them? And part of it is sales, and part of it is giving them stuff to do that gets them involved in the nuts and bolts of things. And some ports, ours, we have a very small staff, so it's really easy here. You are pretty much one deep in a lot of our functional areas there, so we pin the rose on you, and it's yours. You run with it, and guess what? You only come back if you need help, because the rest of us are doing all the stuff that we've got to do all by ourselves. So that's sort of but if you can get somebody who's young, and I think we talk about logistics, and that's what we do. We move stuff, or we help people move stuff. there's a science to that. There's a whole education behind that. And there are so many different aspects to it that I think it's hard to not find something that interests you to hook onto. And it's taking young folks when you get them and feeding their curiosity about these different things, or giving them the chance to do a few different things in the time they're there, that I think is what's going to serve us well in the long run. I mean, we've a lot of us older folks have come into this with having gone through the school of hard knocks someplace else, and so you can weather some of the crazy things that happen a little bit easier. But it's finding somebody who you can take by the hand and watch you do that can learn and keep the learn from it, and maybe pick up the pace when you're ready to step back. That's I think exciting. We just got to be a little bit not play our cards as close to the vest, not be as protective of what it is we know, and start sharing some of that, because there's a lot of young folks out there with a lot of curiosity that I think would be great in this business.
Yeah, it's always mentoring of the next generation is always a very critical factor here, and that certainly, we encourage young people to work with folks who have been in the industry for a while and stuff. And
Yeah.
I find it very universal that a lot of the people who are now leading ports have a different perspective on it. They're willing to work with young people. They empower their young people, and they want them to be successful. And I think that's an amazing thing, to see that, because, I remember when I first went to sea, we used to complain about the captains. A lot of them were hawse pipers and stuff like that. And they didn't really particularly care for the academy kids, right? So, we all persevered and basically said, when we get to be captains, we're not going to be like that. Right. Well, sometimes we were worse, unfortunately. So, but the reality in all of this is that, I think the message to not only senior executives as well as young people is that senior executives need to have a mentoring mentality, and to work with their people and to empower them and to help them as much as possible, because they're the generation that's coming up, and they're going to be doing the jobs that people like yourself are doing right now. And this is a tough industry. Sometimes it's very challenging, and to do this in Alaska is even more challenging. So I think the reality in all of this is that you certainly have persevered through a lot of interesting challenges. You've had funding issues, you've had a lot of other things that you've had to deal with, but I think the recognition needs to be is that our industry is attracting, keeping, and growing good professionals, right? For many years, we gave jobs to people out of politics, the governor's brother or somebody along those lines. And now I'm seeing more and more people who are coming up through the industry, who are in these senior positions and stuff. And I think that's a wonderful place to be. So,
I
go ahead.
think I was going to say, I think it should also be important to kind of mention, IAMPE has reached out to universities and made partnerships that has allowed us to sort of get involved in the curriculum at different universities, so that kids in college who are going into supply chain and logistics type career fields find out that there's this thing called a port, and that there's some of what they're going to learn that is applicable to helping run a port. And maybe we steer some folks to be looking for opportunities and jobs there than than where they would otherwise look. So there's those relationships into the education world are, I think, important to us as well.
Well, I appreciate that, Steve, and I appreciate your time today. And as always, I appreciate your service on the Board of Advisors and all the hard work that you do and helping to guide the organization to making sure we're relevant and making sure that we are out there doing the things that the industry needs, and preparing in the new generation. But it's not just about our training, it's also about coming into an atmosphere and an environment that encourages growth and management growth as well. And certainly very pleased to see that you have that philosophy, and that's a great way. I think enjoying what you're doing, enjoying the challenges, and I think putting up with all the, what's today's blue plate special?
Yeah,
You do.
it is. It's there. The nice thing about it, the attractive thing about it is there's really never a dull moment. There's always something happening, and I get that. I get that when folks come down and visit us here at the port, and it's you're always dodging something. There's always something weird and unique that has happened that you got to respond to. I mean, it is it's a lot of fun. It is still a lot of fun.
When I started out in the industry, I remember we used to say that going to sea was 98% boredom and 2%, panic.
Pure
And
terror.
right. And then when I came into the port industry, I noticed it was like 98% panic and 2% boredom. So it's entirely different. So,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
Steve, I want to thank you very much for your time today.
Oh, you're welcome.
And I trust that all of that white stuff behind you is starting to melt and soon will be replaced by flowers and fauna and wildlife. And
Well, full disclosure, that white stuff behind me is a picture I took when my wife and I went to Antarctica in January.
oh, no kidding.
Yeah. So that's not although it tends to look like that up here, come November. So it's not that out of place.
Well, here in Maine, I can tell you it's not that much different. So, well,
Yeah.
Steve,
No,
thank you so much for your time today, and as always for the good work that you do. And we'll look forward to seeing you again in the very near future.
enjoyed it. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate
All
you
right.
asking me.
Thank you.
Bye.